Hello, welcome to Movement Parallels Life, and today I want to share with you a little bit of my flow practice. The majority of this video is going to be dedicated to pattern practice, where we'll be looking at and breaking down these individual pieces of movement that will comprise the flow. And towards the end of the video, I'll share with you some examples of how I like to move and flow, and I hope it gives you some ideas. And before we get too far, I just want to give you a heads up that this is going to be a different type of practice. It'll likely be more challenging to follow along with. It's more challenging for me to create a practice like this. And it's because we're taking this idea of structure and putting it on the shelf for a while and instead focusing on expression. There are no prescribed sets and reps here. I've even chosen to not label these movement patterns. The natural response is to want to give these movements a home, give them a name, give them a place to belong, a discipline that they originated from. The message that I want to share with you today is that movement is more like a language, and this practice is about creating greater fluency in that language. And by letting go of the need to define these movements and put them into a box, we create space for our own personal expression. All right, I think it's important to set that tone, but let's get into the practice. So starting from this crawl position, allowing my weight to shift back to my heels in this loaded foot hand crawl position, and then springing forward into a large step, placing the foot next to the hands. Once we're in this position, we can start to add movement, weight shifting forward and backward, or these circular rotational movements that will continue to help mobilize the hips, knees, and ankles. And apart from the mobility benefits, this movement pattern will play into our flow, giving us a transition into a squat or a lunge, up to standing, or serve as a way to change orientation as we're crawling. Let's move on to the next pattern. Here we're looking at a lateral roll across the hips. Once again, we're in this foot hand crawl position, loading the weight back towards the heels and then shifting weight to the side, rolling right across the hips. Through the transition, the hands reposition and press strongly into the ground to continue supporting some of the body weight. By maintaining a good brace through the core and actively pushing strongly through the points of support, we ensure that the movement stays smooth and efficient. The challenge is keeping the momentum, but having a smooth transition from the crawl position onto the hip. Without the proper momentum, the movement will be slow or disjointed. But if we move too quickly, we might lose some of that momentum through impact on the ground. So start slowly, working through the transition piece by piece, step by step. Gradually begin adding speed, but maintaining smoothness. Rhythm and timing are important parts of the flow practice. You may notice that I'm rocking back and forth or incorporating these smaller, more subtle movements right before I time the roll. In many cases, this rhythm and timing is more important than the actual mechanics of the movement. The movement is adaptable, but the way you time it is what preserves the smoothness and the fluidity. Let's move on to the next pattern, another variation of rolling. This time, instead of rolling over the hips, we're rolling across the back. Essentially, we have the same execution here, but we're going to be using different surfaces of our body to transition through the roll. Let's have a look in slow motion. I backload my crawl, drive my elbow into my side, and assume this tuck position as I roll across my back. The elbows stay tight to the body as I complete the roll, and then press up onto my hands and feet. The two keys to this movement are lowering the center of gravity and driving the elbows into the side to assume that tuck position that's so conducive to rolling. Once again, by sinking the hips back or backloading the crawl, we lower the center of gravity. From there, driving the elbow in towards the side not only helps smooth the transition, but if we do have a loss of control and there is some impact, we're in a good position to brace and absorb that impact without injury. Let's move on to our next pattern. I'll commonly call this the crawl kick through. So we're going from a foot-hand crawl position into a tripod position. This action is performed from a contralateral or opposite hand and foot base of support. It's quite possible you're already familiar with this movement pattern. For the sake of our flow, we're going to add a little bit more complexity and intensity with this jump. That little hop takes the weight into the arms and frees up the legs. As the legs recontact the ground, that's when we're going to seamlessly transition into the tripod position. We're looking for this rhythm here, backloading the hips, springing forward to float the hips up, and then as we contact the ground, seamlessly transitioning into that tripod. This is very taxing, no doubt. You want to find positions where you can rest and actively recover without interrupting the flow or taking yourself out of the practice. Keep the movements small and smooth to begin with as you're getting the feel for things. As the feet leave the ground, the arms must push harder into the ground to support the body weight and reduce the impact upon landing. Once your body understands this timing, then you can start to dial the intensity by jumping higher. Moving on to our next pattern, very similar to the crawling kick through, now we're actually making a transition from the foot hand crawl to the inverted crawl. I commonly call this the pass under transition or the tripod transition. Again, it's very likely that you've seen this movement before, you've practiced this movement, and the key lies in creating stability on the opposite hand and foot, the contralateral base of support. From this base, the body rotates and the leg always passes underneath the body. It's not wrong to reach or step across the body to make this transition, but this movement is going to be more efficient and take up less space. As you continue to dial the smoothness of this movement, we can increase the intensity by adding the same jump that we used with the kick-through pattern. From the inverted crawl, reach the hand across the body for the ground. The same side leg pushes into the ground to float the hips into the air. The key to this movement is reaching for the ground, planting, and pushing through locked out arms. And the last pattern we'll bring into our flow today, I commonly call it a lateral shuffle crawl, and that'll take us into a wide stance squat. In simplest terms, through this transition, the weight shifts from the feet to the hands and then back to the feet. The two key elements of this movement are scapular strength and stability and core strength. In order to float through this transition, you need to have the straight arm strength to maintain a strong push into the ground and momentarily hold most of the body weight so the hips can float and the legs can reposition. At the same time you push through the arms, you're bracing strongly through the core to create lift and lightness in the lower body. Again, it takes a lot of effort to make this transition smooth and fluid. Your squat serves as your rest position, and it's not a static squat either. Shift your weight from side to side, change the positioning of your feet to balance different ways. These are all elements of the flow and this idea of staying in constant motion. An element of progression here is transitioning out of that lateral motion up to standing. From here, the key element is how we change levels. Smoothly lowering the center of gravity, planting the hands, pushing through those locked out arms, and floating through the transition. Alternatively, you can keep the hips high and the legs straighter and float through the transition in more of a hinge than a squat. You'll see a demonstration of this shortly. So we've looked at the patterns in isolation, and hopefully you've gotten a chance to practice them and play around with them a little bit, figure out how they work for your body, and figure out how you can start to be more adaptable with them. These pieces will require a lot more practice, and not even require, but deserve practice. In the world of fitness, we often think of exercises as movements having a exact form, and we want to make sure that we have good form or that we're quote unquote doing it right. This, however, isn't that. While the flow practice, I think, lends itself to athleticism and cardiovascular conditioning and strength and stability and all these things that we desire in fitness, it's not about fitness. It's about expression. In that regard, this practice is more like a martial art or playing a musical instrument. This isn't solely focused on burning calories and toning body parts. And each of these movements fits into a larger narrative. And that's why we practice them hundreds of times, thousands of times, to explore them, to craft them, to really deeply understand them so they become ours. They become our tools for movement expression. And I know that might sound crazy or idealistic or maybe a hard concept to wrap your head around. And it's because we live in a world that puts movement in a box, that tells us that movement occurs in designated spaces at designated times, and it has an exact form. In our modern world, movement is becoming less and less necessary. That doesn't change the fact that our bodies were designed for and are maintained through movement. But how old were you when the world told you that you had to stop moving? That it was time to stop playing and sit in a desk for 8 hours a day? That it was time to pick a sport, become an athlete, and train hard to win at all costs? When did it stop being fun? When did it become more about keeping up an appearance of what society says we should be, rather than being who we are? When all is said and done, what good is having a voice if you don't speak your mind? And what good is having your body if you don't move like you? Thanks for watching.